Tihe Moriora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know, my name is Brendan O'Connell. I'm with AgriTech New Zealand, and today we'll be hosting this session in partnership with Research Systems and MPI. Very glad to have you here. Like we say, we think it shows a good degree of dedication to the system and to the sector when we have people turning up on a Friday afternoon to talk about something as exciting as data standards. Really good to have you all here. Obviously, you got the reminders for this webinar conference. If you do happen to have contacts with other people who are coming along today and maybe trying to use the original meeting item from the first registration, we switched the system over from a meeting to a webinar because of the number of people that were interested. So if you happen to know of somebody who's struggling to get on, you might just let them know to look at their emails for the latest link. We've got two main topics today. They're strongly interrelated, of course. One is an introduction and discussion about an AgriTech data reference group. And the second is some discussion about a geospatial agricultural data working group, which Andrew from Reserve will take us through. But to give us some opening remarks first, I'd like to pass over to Kenneth Irons, who is the chair of AgriTech New Zealand. Kenneth.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you to everybody that's joining. I can see the numbers popping up. It's great to see a number of well-known names on the list from A to X. And it's also great to see a number of names that are new. So a very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for your attention and attendance today. AgriTech New Zealand's proud to have a pivotal role in the work that's happening across industry and government. You'll all be very familiar with the Industry Transformation Plan. That's really the forerunner for that ITP model that the New Zealand government is rolling out across a number of sectors. AgriTech has the privilege and pleasure of being the first of those, of 6 so far. And this is just a great degree of momentum gathering across the sector. We're very clear that the primary sector in New Zealand is essential to the New Zealand economy. It was already, but doubly so in the COVID context where tourism struggling as so many people are having to work really hard to maintain their position in tourism. And we appreciate and respect our colleagues in that sector. But also we know that the primary sector is terribly important to the New Zealand economy for many, many reasons. That means that AgriTech is a facilitator first and foremost of the primary sector. It is, of course, a sector in itself, or you might say a subsector, and we're very keen, all of us, hundreds of us, to recognise that AgriTech in and of itself is important. It's important globally, it's important domestically, and just very quickly, you'll be pleased to know that recently I signed a memorandum of understanding on behalf of AgriTech New Zealand with my opposite number, Andrew Coppin of AgriTech, or AgriTech, Australian AgriTech Association. And so our influence and engagement is broad across New Zealand. It's now broadening across Australasia. And we think there is very significant opportunities and benefits to every individual member, from small startups to established small businesses to mid-sized companies with maybe 10, 2, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 million, through to the larger corporates that are in the hundreds of millions, and then right through to our largest corporate, Fonterra, that's also a member of AgriTech. So we think there's a tremendous lot of opportunity for all of us, locally, regionally, environmentally, and data is at the centre of that. Precision Ag Association, it was a forerunner to AgriTech. Andrew and I were part of work going back many, many years on data and data interoperability and data standards. And if you really, I guess I'll go out on a bit of a limb here, Andrew, and say that if the cornerstone of agricultural technology is data, and that means high quality, machine readable, centre originated, non-human populated data, not bits of records on a fag packet. If the cornerstone of that, then the cornerstone of the cornerstone is geospatial. We've got to know where that data comes from, because we're a 3-dimensional market, and geospatial work and mapping and so on is critically important, as I think is represented by how many people we have attending today. So thank you for your participation. Thank you for your attendance today. There's an awful lot going on, and we're gaining momentum across a number of fronts, none more important than data and data standards, and geospatial work is part of that. So with those welcome comments, I'm happy to hand back to Brendan, and who Brendan will hand over to Andrew. Look forward to Q&A at the end, and to your participation, not only during this webinar, but to the working groups that will flow off the back of it. So thank you all very much, and a very warm welcome to you all.
Sure, thanks, Kenneth. And so, yeah, like I mentioned at the outset, there are two related objectives today. One is to seek expressions of interest to join an AgriTech data reference group. This group will be representing the sector and AgriTech New Zealand in some significant discussions, and I'll go into some detail around what we mean by that and how we will structure that group. And then I'll hand over to Andrew, and we will be discussing through and seeking expressions of interest to join a specific working group on geospatial data, seeking to develop technical agreements on geospatial ag data. So that's the focus of today. Please do use Q&A to ask any questions. Between the three of us, we'll look at paying attention to that and trying to answer questions as we can. Like I say, I'm sorry that we had to switch to a webinar format, but we've got such a large number of people, we couldn't keep this to a meeting format at this time, but there will be further forums and opportunities to engage in a more direct way over the next while. Until then, you have to listen to me. And do use the chat as well to drive any discussions that you wish. All of this is being recorded, and it will be available after the meeting for your colleagues or to remind yourself of things. And we'll be paying quite a bit of attention to the transcript of the chat as well. So please do speak freely. I know that there are many topics here that will be near and dear to many of us. Quite interesting yesterday, since we come and talk about data, just to look at some of the budget announcements. Not a real surprise, but 37 million going towards a national integrated farm planning system, and some interesting language coming through here. We know that right now in the sector, there is a burning platform for really looking at how farmers and growers experience their digital foundations, their digital work, and what information they can exchange. They're being asked to respond to some significant issues by developing their farm environmental plans. And I think it's beholden on all of us as a sector to make sure that from a policy point of view and from a practice point of view, that happens as seamlessly as possible. And we support our sector here, as well as building capabilities that we can demonstrate to the rest of the world overseas. So timing is right, and I know we'll speak about timing and speak about maybe past projects and the like as well. Very briefly, I know we have many members on the with us here today, and maybe there's some people that aren't as familiar with AgriTech New Zealand. We are a non-government organisation. We're an independent, membership-driven group that seek to advocate, to connect, and to promote AgriTech as a sector. We have a strong partnership role with government, which is belied or demonstrated rather through the industry transformation plan that's in place and the focus that we're getting from all of government on AgriTech as a sector. We do a lot of other work in terms of engagement and representation across the industry. We've just finished our 11-venue roadshow, speaking to over 600 people on what the ITP means for them, and I'll speak about that, results of some of that, and why that brings us here today and the topics that we've got today. And as Kenneth alluded to, we also, as a sort of single reference point, are able to maintain relationships with a lot of organizations around the world that have some similar interests in their jurisdictions, or some similar interests in getting to know us here. So that includes Oz AgriTech, AgriTech E in the UK, Western Growers in the States, and some fresh relationships that are just emerging on the Digital Data Agri-Food Alliance, which I've just got completely wrong. Kenneth can update us on that later another time, but European data food based groups as well. So having a sort of I guess a single point of contact. I was going to say throat to catch, but I won't. A single point of contact has some real benefits, and we're very grateful for the 150 so members that we currently have. Thank you for your support, and if you're not a member, of course, please do get in touch and discuss what it can mean for you. We've talked about the context of the industry transformation plan. It's significant for a couple of reasons. One, because of the focus on the sector, in general, and looking at how AgriTech can grow and how its role in New Zealand primary industry and export can grow. But also it specifically has a focus on data regulations and standards is the language that's used in the ITP. So there's some context there that's worth going through. I'm not going through the whole plan, don't worry for those who've already been through this several times, but just a reminder that it is an all of government approach with industry collaboration. AgriTech New Zealand have been the main partner in that work and continue to be an engagement facilitator in this process and a lot of adjacent processes. For any of you that have worked with government, you'll know that having an all of government approach is actually really important and not trivial. They are not natural collaborators between themselves. And yet in this context, they are coming together and doing some really good work together. And our role is to try and keep some good industry focus on that, act as a partner with them, and keep the right sort of focus and discussions going at different times. ITPs in general, they really are looking at this high intensity approach, some investment. Really the ITP investment we've got so far, we consider to be seed investment. There's definitely further money available. We see it in a light way through this budget, but we see it in a direct way through some of the funding requests that are making their way through and the potential for further funding. So it's definitely an area worth looking in. And it is, of course, a long-term vision. So I think a lot of the things will be near and dear to many of us here today when we talk about geospatial data, what that means for our current offerings, what it means for our current businesses. But all of this is definitely being done with a long-term vision in terms of what we're trying to create. These are long-term capabilities. And in terms of ITP contexts, there's two types of ITP, basically scaling up value and moving from value to volume. AgriTech is very much sitting in that space of trying to scale up value from the nascent industry that we've got. And many of the topics that are in the AgriTech ITP, the first of the ITPs, will of course be common to other sectors. And whilst there are some, when we come to regulations and standards and discussions around data interoperability, there are some unique aspects of that to our sector and New Zealand primary industry. There are also many shared aspects of that as well, especially when it comes to things like digital identity and discussions around that. So I think we'll see some links with a lot of those other ITPs over time. I'm not going to go through all of these different ITPs, but just given the context that there are various work streams of work, many of you will be familiar with those things. From the roadshow that we did, we spoke with over 600 people and got some feedback. They got that previous slide. Anybody who was in the room knew that they had 2 hours of a lot of material thrown at them by David Downs and myself. It was a bit of a see how long people could last and see how much information we could throw at them. But what was interesting was to see where some of the common interest points were. So we paid a lot of attention going through the survey forms and the feedback forms that we got from those 600. We obviously got a lot of anecdotal input from just listening and talking to people and seeing of all of that stuff, what was interest to them. And given that you guys are spending your Friday afternoon coming here to talk about data interoperability, it's probably no surprise that that was a major theme. When people looked through the ITP and had either what's in it for me hat on, or were just thinking about what are the immediate things that they're dealing with, concerned about, data interoperability was high on the list. It's been high on the list of PANs, as Kenneth mentioned, for a long time, and for AgriTech New Zealand. So it's keeping it on that list, and it's definitely something that we will continue to work on behalf of all our members and the sector. So here we are. This is the work stream owned by MPI in this context. Because of the MPI ownership of this, of course, there's a strong interrelationship with other work going on in their jurisdiction, particularly integrated farm plans, and that's why a lot of the initial focus is quite rightly on that burning platform in the industry now. And so the areas of focus there are, of course, interoperability, concepts of open data. If any of you are at the roadshows, you would have heard David Downs speaking about that and looking at some of the data ownership and data access implications of open data and what's happened in the banking system, and thinking what that could mean across primary industry. plenty of discussion and variations in regulatory requirements with different councils, of course, and the council are actively engaging in these discussions in a really positive way. So that's bringing some good focus. And really looking at addressing what interoperability does. I think it's worth acknowledging, and you'll see this from the materials that we go through today and the approach that we're taking, that in no way, shape or form are we claiming that the work in something like data standards is the solution to interoperability. We know that there are many other issues and many important issues there. We'll speak to some of the other work that's going on. Today is looking at what the enabling value and the foundational value is of an approach that's related to open standards. And Andrew will take us through the context for that and the full meaning of that in his session later on. So we're here, I guess, not to solve all of these things in one plan. We're here to put the foundations in place that the solutions will flow a lot easier later on. And I see both of the requests that we have here today will have that contribution. So first up, my piece. This is the piece from AgriTech New Zealand and the work that we've been doing with the forums we've been getting engaged in, and trying to more completely make sure that we're representing the agri-tech sector in the forums that we are now engaged in and being asked to engage in. So we're seeking to form an agri-tech data reference group, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about that. So the role of the reference group is really to looking at bringing some of the leadership, the thought leaders from across the agri-tech NZ membership for the whole sector, so to represent a shared industry perspective. We are very aware that in all the discussions that are happening in the sector around data interoperability right now, and around data usage, that there needs to be a stronger voice from the people who are developing software solutions. They're responsible for investments they're doing in that space, for IP that they've generated, for the customers that they're already looking after, and therefore we need to make sure that there is some good and shared view representation. We've been doing that where we can, and we believe that this reference group is going to enable us to do that a lot better. So that's the primary purpose there. We do want to tie in and be a channel to give additional leadership and guidance. We know that there are many good leaders in the sector who are already doing good work independently in their organizations and lobbying and advocating where they can. We would like to add fuel to that fire and be able to act as an independent group that bring those thoughts together. And so we want to be able to bring that together, to be able to work in partnership with government and to support data collaboratives, which is a key point from today as well. And that independence is a key piece, as well as being a purveyor of information and just keeping more people informed of what's going on. So there are less closed shops and more engagement, whilst data collaboratives can still continue and thrive. So that's the role of the reference group. When we look at bringing people in here, the request that we'll have, and I'll talk a little bit about the composition of this group and why we're putting it together in this way. We do want it to be truly representative, which means that we can't have everybody in the room. The interest in this topic is massive. 200 people registered for this webinar, which is not a surprise. We've had, workshops with 50 people in them before. That shows a great level of engagement and support, but it's a difficult way to really move things forward. So we're looking at a representative group that has some proper stakeholder representation, sufficient competitive tension, that no one region, no one business is controlling the story too much, and it really is a representative, independent voice for the sector as a whole. So people who ultimately take part in this reference group, they will be representing a stakeholder group and the sector, not just the views of their own organisation. And we will, of course, be looking to continue in this partnership with government to prove both data interoperability and data use in the sector. Maybe at this point, I'll just take a quick sideward step. First of all, I'll pull up an image that I hope you see as ironic. It's not quite the fag packet that Kenneth was talking to, but it's not far off it, the paper and pen of how things are done currently. The paper and pen that's probably assumed by many people in some of their farm environmental plans, coming up in the next while as well. The paper and pen that is actually probably from a government policy point of view is all too often assumed within the policy settings rather than really looking at what we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to achieve both for our sector and for the prosperity of New Zealand. So just a couple of things on why I think we're here. We're talking about technologies in our sector that are no longer emerging. These, when we look at what's happening around the sector, many of you will be aware of these things. Some of them are just signals or indicators of what's happening. Some of them are directly impacting on some of the topics that we're talking about today. But we have, just traveling around this week to the Landwise conference and to the AgriTech in the Vineyards conference, speaking to 6 different organizations actively building up great AI data sets and training platforms for many different applications. There's just so much activity going on in that space that it's really exciting. Seeing the smart machines, autonomous vehicles in the vineyard at Pernod Ricard just felt like a step forward into the future. For many of us, we weren't aware of what was going on there until we see those vehicles there. We're well aware of the number of sensors collecting information related to our water and our environment and stuff, and that's going to continue. We have significant examples of blockchain actively being used commercially. The Frontiera example of bill of lading was a very interesting one and a very marked one in terms of what it could mean in terms of those transactions. And I'll speak a little bit about the Trust Alliance and TrackBack briefly as well in a while, and sort of the work that they're doing in using some of those technologies to do what they do best in terms of building of trust and connections and all the other technologies. So the reality is that these things, even though our ministries might not see it all the time, even though our primary sector partners may not believe it all the time, these are not emerging technologies. These are real capabilities, and they're only going to grow. And I think anybody within our ecosystem is well aware of that. The ITP was set up to look at amplifying and realizing the opportunity and the value that AgriTech can bring to all of New Zealand for all of New Zealand. We sit at 1.4 billion in export revenue supposedly from in 2019, and that's been relatively stable. The argument is that there can be a twofold impact in terms of what role AgriTech can play. One is in the primary sector productivity and sustainability, enabled by some better behaviors, some better data use, some better data sharing. And so that's a large part of what we're talking about here today, as well as encouraging new businesses. But also there's the global impact. And there's no doubt that if anybody knows anything about New Zealand, it's food. That's what we're known for. I hear people talking about that from, in remote parts of Afghanistan. When they say, have you heard about New Zealand? They will turn around and go, yes, you do food. And so that's good for our primary industry, but it's also a leadership position that we've got as well to really demonstrate what good food systems mean and how we do that in a digital world and set the digital foundations for that. So for me, I think we've got both a commercial opportunity and a global leadership opportunity here. And the size of the prize for New Zealand, well, 10 billion is a number that's easy to pick. You won't get me claiming to a timeline for that number, but we all know it's real because it's already been proven by nations who are smaller than us and have less than us. When you look at somewhere like Israel, who has the same level of investment in science and R&D in our spaces, and you have 10 times the amount of AgriTech exports. So it's not plucked out of the sky. It's absolutely in reality. And for me, I think our sector is going to play a significant part in the future of New Zealand and will be the future of New Zealand's primary industry. So important that we think of those things. It's also important that we recognize that our public sector partners don't always think of technology in their policy thinking. We have seen examples of that with the Reserve Bank bill, with the Water Services bill coming recently as well. We can see that there are no mention of some of the digital technologies in there, and now we have the Farm Environmental Plans framework being worked on, and we need to make sure that there was full consideration, not just what our producers and growers are dealing with now and today and how we support them there, but what they're going to be dealing with going forward for all of these reasons as well. So significant context to be thinking about the ecosystem of our data here in New Zealand in these contexts. We have a lot of separate programs. all of them very worthy, many of them of which we're benefiting from. The focus is great. And going forward, the real opportunity is to look at how that comes together in a true national plan for our digital strategy. So AgriTech New Zealand is part of the NZ Tech Alliance, and together we're very keen on driving those discussions and understanding how these things come together. And of course, front and center there in the middle of us talking about trust and identity, which we will for our sector. We can't talk about it in our sector without acknowledging the country we live in and everything else that's happening as well. So those things are going to be coming together. So that's the context, I guess, for the industry. I want to acknowledge some of the really good work from our partners and friends out there. The data collaborative work that's going on through the Trust Alliance, we're a big supporter of. We think there's some very sound thinking in there, some very skilled people and some good networks forming. So we're a champion for them. And if you are not aware of what they're doing, I suggest you reach out and find out what they're doing. The work that we're talking to today, we hope will supercharge groups like this, and we will remain active supporters of what they do, and of other collaborative groups that we see emerging around the sector. It's exactly what we need. We do have some in the context of this AgriTech Data Forum reference group. That group will be will have the skills and talents it needs to make some direction, make some decisions, and drive some good discussion themselves. So we're looking forward to being able to be part of creating that forum. We do have some starting hypotheses, and these are things that set the tone. People may have varied views to these things. We look forward to hearing those varied views. Although some of them I think are just relatively straightforward. So first and foremost, data collaboratives and partnership development with the ecosystem, we know have to be encouraged. That's the only way trust can happen. That's the only way we can get connections working across, and that's what data interoperability ultimately means. As has been said by many times, I think it might have been I don't know if it was Chris Claridge or Collier who phrased this term. I've heard it along the way and I've used it many times, so somebody deserves credit for it, but data interoperability is not a problem. Human interoperability is the problem. So anywhere that we can find good partnerships and data collaboratives going, we support them. We believe that they can be better enabled through data standards. We believe that the process of defining data standards needs to be transparent, collaboratively created, have good stakeholder representation, and be independent of any one commercial solution. And you'll see what Andrew represents here today and how we see and how we're effectively prototyping and continuing how we think that can happen. We recognize that we're operating globally, of course, and therefore there needs to be alignment and link with international standards. In some cases, as Andrew and the team have proven, we can not only align with those, we can drive and lead those standards in many cases. And Andrew has already shown that through the work that that's been done through some livestock standards and how the farm code of practice has been adopted more overseas than it has been in New Zealand of interest. We believe that data standards are not the answer. It is not our proposal that data interoperability gets solved by data standards. We just know that the data interoperability is improved and happens faster and is supported when there are good data standards. And there are many other issues that need to be addressed. And again, Andrew will be speaking to the interrelationship between those and where this work in the geospatial work that we discussed today fits with there. Again, back to my points about the potential for the agri-tech sector. I think some of these issues we're looking at, we think we're just solving farm environmental plans right now, an important problem to solve, and things that are in front of us, but it's also in the context of data going to be the future of our primary sector and global sectors, and the role that New Zealand has in that, both from a leadership point of view and from an export point of view, and primary industry needs us to do that. So those are some of the starting hypotheses, and looking forward to some of the discussions that will come out of this group that we're seeking to form. Composition of this group, we see it being around 9 plus or minus 2 members. We as a membership group, we've structured ourselves to be representative of the sector, and so we want to extract from that representation from our membership who cover who cover these type of business sizes, and in doing that, we'll also need to consider some regional balance and some proper diversity across that group as well. So there'll be many factors that will need to be considered. Today, we'll be asking for expressions of interest to be involved. That could be for yourself or for somebody you nominate that you think should be this. These are likely to be our corporate leaders, our thought leaders, our people who are really willing to commit some of their time, energy, and thought processes into advocating for the sector. Meeting frequency, yet so the group will end up selecting a chair and vice chair. We see a face-to-face meeting being necessary just to establish some existing or some initial trust and understanding, and after that, just regular video conference meetings as required, depending on the type of topics that are coming into the coming across the table of that group and being needed to address in the sector. So the process, we do have terms of reference for this group. Happy to send that out to anybody, and we can make that available. We will put that link for the Google Forms to gather expressions of interest in the chat as soon as I'm able to get off here and figure out how I can cut and paste without destroying the presentation. And we are seeking, given the level of interest and the number of people we've got here today and discussions that have been around the sector, we'd hope that in the next week people can just register their expression of interest, and so we can look at getting this started and lined up with other groups. So that's it from me today. I will give you that link for expressing interest in the AgriTech reference group. We're moving from a dark slide format to a much lighter one. So when Andrew flips over here, you'll be impressed with the colors and the vibrancy that starts coming through from the dark black slides that I've been showing. Nothing meant by that, but let me hand over to Andrew Cook, and he'll take you on to our second topic and second request today, which is the Geospatial reference group.
Excellent. Thanks, Brendan. And hopefully I'm now taking over control of Brendan's computer. And Brendan, I'm not going to install any ransomware on it. You're absolutely fine. Hey, look, great to see in that long list of 106 plus names, many people whose names I recognise, and many of you have talked with me prior to this meeting, and we've discussed all sorts of things in data interoperability, and so I'm very glad to have you with us today. You've probably already picked up, Brendan and I are talking about two different groups, interlinked, and so really the AgriTech group is very much fulfilling that governance sort of role and interacting with industry and government. I'm going to talk about much more of what I would call a sort of project working group. So I just want to make that clear so there's not confusion between the two. Quick rundown on, whoops, we've gone the wrong way. Quick rundown on me. For those who don't know me, going in all directions, Brendan, there's a bit of a delay. For those who don't know me, I manage Research Systems. Research is a software company which was formed by a spin out from AgriSearch back in 2004. And we don't market software under our own brand so much. We create bespoke software for people in Australia, New Zealand, UK, cooperatives, agribusinesses, agri-tech companies, and we've had, because of our background, a bit of a speciality in things like pasture systems and livestock performance and obviously farm data. And that's been a big part of what we've done. In July last year, Research was acquired by Map of Agriculture Group, which is a company that started in New Zealand and has really grown into the UK. And I look after the New Zealand company, and I'm Chief Technology Officer and really probably ag data specialist for the global group. And I've been trying to do stuff in this area since probably about 2012, 2013. And some of my colleagues in Rosier have been banging away on this for longer, as have some of you. So where did this come from? Some of it is work, as you can see, on data linker and related projects. And we'll talk more about that shortly. Also work that we carried out earlier this year on behalf of the Ministry for Primary Industries, looking into what people are doing about interoperability in agriculture globally. What are the different approaches they're taking? What are the different ways they're trying to solve interoperability problems? And we will talk about that shortly. And of course, there are many groups right at the moment who are working on specific interoperability challenges. In the chat, you'll have seen comments from Ollie and others about what they're doing in vineyards in Australia. Absolutely. We're working with groups in the UK around arable data. In New Zealand, farm plans are the focus. And although I'm talking about a project that is MPI funded today, I cannot answer any questions about the 37 million for a single farm plan that was announced in the budget yesterday. I've got no ideas. I see there's some from the MPI team here today, so I'm sure they'll take your questions away, and you might hear something in due course. There's a lot of people working on projects in sustainability and climate change adaptation and mitigation. And there's a lot of people who've said to me, surely we should come together and just crack this. I think we always oversimplify, but let's see whether we can do that in at least a little piece of the puzzle. Right. Here's some of the work that, which way is it going, Brendan? Do you want to just take us back to that previous slide? I think maybe it doesn't, thank you, it doesn't like being remote controlled. So we'll just see how we get on.
I'll keep my hand still. I'm sorry, Andrew.
That's it.
I was trying to answer questions online, but I can't do that at the same time that you're doing that. I'll stop.
No. I told you I'd taken over your PC. So different models of data interoperability that are being used around the world, particularly looking at what's happening in the ag sector. And we categorize them into 5 sort of broad classes. Data collectors, that's typically farm and related software packages that have grown into a interoperability tool. And there's some of those, there's some great examples, excellent tools, really good at interoperating with and connecting to a wide range of devices, but obviously under the control of that one company that develops that particular software tool. So not great on the widespread participation sort of end in terms of technologies. There's data hubs, which pull all data together into a single system, and that is often seen as a good way of gathering data and doing stuff with it. Again, not great in terms of participation, but I've seen some really good approaches where people have created hubs and then defined some standards on them, and so everyone interacts with it in the same way, which is quite powerful. There's brokers, which are often tools that where the data is not held centrally, but there's a central permissions or control module, and joint data in the Netherlands would be a great example of that. There's a network model, which is much more like, I guess, the rest of the internet operates, which is you define some standards, everyone implements them, and magically stuff works together. And that's obviously very standard driven, very easy sort of for people to participate. But actually there's a bit of a barrier to entry there in that everyone has to kind of build or construct or buy their bit and do it. And so that you can see the adoption side of those slows down. And distributed ledgers, which is really the network model on steroids. Highly distributed, very standards based, and again, challenges around adoption. I won't go into those further. If you want to have a chat about that or more of a talk to me about that, happy to do that later on. Right, so 5 different models, but lots of recurring components that all of those models have to address. And I've listed 12. There's potentially, you could argue there's some more, and I'm not going to go and list out all of what those are, but you see some of the things that Brendan mentioned, things like governance, commercials, which is the agreements one between organisations, permission, how do farmers and others control their data, authorization and identity, which ties together with the sort of digital identity type jigsaw puzzle piece that Brendan had earlier. So there are a lot of different components. And when we talk about sort of data interchange and data standards, we're actually only touching on some subsets of those. Typically, messages, the meaning of different fields within the messages, maybe some reference data or some valid values or whatever else, maybe some API protocols, maybe some entity IDs, which ID system are we going to use for farms or whatever else, right? So those are the pieces that we touch on. All those other squares or rectangles, we don't tend to touch, and those are a lot of the people issues and other technical things that you need to solve to get data interchange happening. So the orange boxes in the picture are the areas that I guess are easiest, still moderately useful, but acknowledging right up front that there's some hard problems around sort of governance and permission and other things that need to be solved as well. Okay, I said I would talk more on data linker, and Brendan and others have said to me, Andrew, you need to mention data linker, otherwise it'll be the elephant in the room. And one of my colleagues has got a wonderful elephant in the room picture, which I must reuse at some stage. Data linker is a project that we did some work on from about 2017, it was, I think if you read the Red Meat Profit Partnership review, you'd say it was unsuccessful. There are some little pieces of it that have been perhaps more successful than that might indicate. But why wasn't it successful, Andrew? Well, probably many reasons. One of the key ones is it was often seen as a hub. If I talk to IT teams about what was involved in data linker, they go, oh, you're talking data models and API specifications. We understand that. But by the time the story got to senior management, the decision makers in some organizations, it was seen as a big database where all of their data was going to end up. And of course, for some organizations, that just wasn't going to be acceptable. So it was often seen as a hub, but it was really a network approach. That brought with it, if you can think back to that chart I had before, some of the strengths and also the weaknesses of a network approach. One of those weaknesses is speed of adoption. There was a commercial model that didn't help with engagement. It was set up on the back of effectively a joint venture between two primary growth partnerships, one of whom had a special purpose vehicle behind it. So data linker needed to have a company to kind of bring it together, and then that company had to have a business model, and so that was an extra confusion that people had to get their heads around. You mean if I use this stuff, I've got to pay some other company for something? Probably the biggest challenge, though, was it relied on each party investing to build their piece, right? It's a network model. It relies on each participant, every company who wants to interchange data, building their side of the interchange. There were few or no pre-built components, so you had to go and do it yourself, which meant that the investment to get involved came with a cost. Now, for some companies, they're doing software development anyway, that cost wasn't a problem, but for others, it was. And my colleague, Graham Ogle, kind of has talked to me about, he reckons for some companies, if you've got a chunk of data, there are relatively few reasons why you would invest to build a service to make that data available. And this goes to some of the people issues, right? One reason you might invest to build a service so that people can access the data you hold is because they are going to pay you for that data, right? The farmers might not like that model, but sometimes it happens, and sometimes you recognize that actually if you want to get data, the cost, you've got to pay the cost of the other party delivering it to you. The second motivation might be that farmers are going to have to pay to make the data available. And we see that too, right? There are some companies who already provide APIs to deliver their data out to anyone else, but the farmer pays for it through a subscription, one of those things. Sometimes the third reason occurs, which is it's politically difficult or it's dangerous or whatever not to make the data available. In other words, there's sufficient pressure from the industry that you feel you should make the data available. Otherwise, you'll be seen to be a holdout against the industry. And realistically, outside of those reasons, there's probably not much reason for people to invest to build the sort of frameworks that they need for their data to be interoperable. Right? So if you're a software company, a startup, and you say, great, I want to access some data, you've got to realize that the other people who you're talking to have probably got some of these things in the backs of their mind, right? Those are some of the people issues. So I guess that's some of my learnings from working on Data Linker for 3 or 4 years. Data Linker, by the way, we wound up Data Linker Limited because it was a special purpose vehicle. Dairy NZ and Beef and Lamb New Zealand hold the copyright on what was created there, and they have made that available as open source and asked AgriTech New Zealand to effectively manage that and take it forward and do something useful with it if there's anything useful that we can do. So hopefully this is one of the useful things that we can do, which is look at geospatial data interoperability. And I want to talk you through the working group approach that we're proposing. Came up with some questions that I thought might be useful or interesting, or that people might be asking about geospatial data. And these are questions that people have put to me as we have been discussing some of this stuff. How do I share, or how do I get, name your data type here? How do I get a list of paddocks, land management units, blocks, wetlands, tracts, farm boundaries? How do we label this spatial data so we know what it claims to be? Right? If you get a shape file, it's just a file of polygons or lines. You can probably work out from the file name what it might be. What are the attributes that go with the spatial shapes? Are there common ones? What are the valid values for those attributes? What are the meanings of those valid values? What's the best way to represent things? You know, both from a data formats perspective. Are we using OGC services? Are we using shapefiles? Are we going to use GeoJSON? Are we going to use, you name the format? Which of the international standards are we going to line up with? Are there useful API patterns? You know, there's people like Ag Gateway and John Deere and others who've done various types of work on these things. And there's some API patterns we could possibly use. If a farmer is using some sort of interoperability to transfer geospatial data from one provider to another, which system is the master? Are there masters for different sets of data? Is one system the master of sort of physical data and the other one's the master of how the farmer is going to manage the land? Does that differ by farm? Do farmers have a preferred tool that they want to use to maintain their map in, and all the other tools that use that map should just get the data from there? And if so, how do we manage updates and changes? So a whole bunch of questions. Some of those are eminently solvable. Some of them are less obvious. And my reason for asking them is not because I want to answer them now, but these are the sorts of things that are on people's minds, and we're hoping that a working group can consider some of these and help us with some direction that we can all build on. So what we are proposing to do is to put together a working group of interested people who are willing to work at a relatively technical level, probably with some guidance from less technical people in their audience or their organization about what's needed, to develop some specifications. And I've been very careful to not use the word standard, right? Because we all think of things like ISO standards, and Standards are great, and there's many people working on them, and don't get me wrong, you can consider any of these things as a standard, but I like to call them specifications because, you know, even if you went as far as Ag Gateway, until things move from Ag Gateway into ISO, they're not actually standards, they're draft standards or they're specifications. So we're looking for some people who are going to participate in those and help us to address specific technical issues that could maybe unlock multiple projects, right? So we talked about TANs before, the Trust Alliance. They've got a work stream around farm environment plans. Other people have got work streams around farm environment plans. There's a lot of geospatial data in farm environment plans. Hey, if we do some of this work, will it help a number of those work streams and other work streams that are trying to do other geospatial things, right? We acknowledge up front that technical solutions are not the whole answer. So this is not going to be a solution for everything. So when you come back to me in 3 years' time and say, Andrew, those geospatial specifications didn't solve everything for us, I won't be surprised, right? Because we're not expecting them to. We're expecting them to contribute and be helpful. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to reuse wherever possible, but we're keen for the people who get involved in this working group to help us choose what to reuse. We're going to take an open source approach. That means that you and anyone else, including people not in the working group, can use what we've created in terms of the specifications. But obviously the cost of being involved is your time to be involved. So make sure it aligns with your interests. Brendan mentioned earlier that this work is a bit of a prototype, and we hope it will be. What we want to show is that if a group of organisations from New Zealand, or looking at the list of people here, New Zealand and Australia, get involved together, then we can come up with something that is valuable, useful, not necessarily complete in solving everything, and we can do it in a structured way that delivers results in a short time frame. So an MVP, right? We're hoping that we will also document that process and what we did and what we learned so that it can be used for other projects in the future. And obviously we're also proposing to put this geospatial stuff into an open source repository so that it can be used and maintained in the long term. Hopefully that makes sense. Normally I'd check in here and say, is everyone understanding? But we'll carry on. What does this look like from a time frame perspective? Thanks to Keith Axon at Rezier for drawing this diagram up. You can see you are here in terms of we're at the kind of overview, the kickoff. What we're proposing is a number, 4, 5, something initial to get us going, and then we'll review, of weekly or fortnightly meetings where we define what we're going to solve. We get in and choose some stuff that we can build on, and we create some prototype or some MVP specifications that we can use. You'll see that there's another phase which is called pilot or early adopter support. Is this timeline too right? Is it too optimistic? It's almost certainly too optimistic, but that's where the funding sits. To support some people with doing some early adopter work, trying things out themselves, building a prototype themselves with their own system. And I said again, we were keen to improve this process and use it again if it was helpful. And so that's the retrospective at the end. Those of you in the agile space will know what I'm meaning. What are our learnings? What are things that we would do differently next time? What worked well? That's the kind of plan. So there's a bit of a who should get involved, how to get involved, which I'll cover here. The first one is, this is primarily or first and foremost a call for what I'd call technical specialists, right? Solution architects, yes, I see your names on the list. Developers, yeah, I see some of you as well. Business analysts and data specialists. I would anticipate probably only 1 to 2 people from each organisation, because we don't want a group of 100 people. It's too hard to work on a specification, right? You want to be able to break it down and have 2 or 3 people working on this section and 2 or 3 people working on that section. When we work in the, I do a lot of work with the International Committee for Animal Recording, defining livestock data standards. That's what Brendan alluded to. They're used by the dairy community internationally, and so particularly across Europe, also US, Australia. They'll get to New Zealand eventually. And interestingly enough, they're based on the data linker work that we did originally a few years ago. That has, a group of probably 30 or 40 people from various organisations who are closely involved, but there's probably only 8 to 10 people who come to most of our 1-hour meetings. So the commitment would be 4, probably, maybe 5 1-hour meetings, plus some contributions. So we expect you to kind of go away and do a bit of research. Maybe you'll ask other people in your organisation, well, what data do we use here? Or you'll go and research what somebody else does in another standard. Or if you're a developer, you might cut some JSON schema code. Right? If you're interested, there's the URL to register, and it's so easy. You can type it into your browser, I hope. We're also looking for organisations who can pilot this. And by pilot, I mean get involved and actually try to do some of this stuff within your own development team. That might be saying, hey, we're already doing stuff with one of the existing work streams that's happening, and we've already got some prototyping happening. We'll pick up the specification work you're doing here and we'll put it into that prototyping work stream. Perfect. It may be that you and another organisation are already talking about transferring some data, and you're saying, well, we were going to create our own one-to-one link, but now actually let's try and do this in a slightly more standards-based manner. Fantastic. There may be, I can't make the commitment because I'm not the funder, but there may be some support available. So for some organisations who are saying, hey, we'd love to do this, but we need to spend our resource on this thing that earns us money, but we've got some resource available that we could otherwise put on this. There may be a way to get some funding, and Brendan might be able to talk to that a little bit during the Q&A time. Certainly, we'll try and facilitate the process of getting some of that funding if there is some with AgriTech New Zealand and MB. If you are interested in piloting this, the same form is going to ask you about, are you interested in piloting this and what's your potential timeframe commitments? Right. It's all potential, it's indicative, but we're really keen to hear and understand. So that's the key. That's my key ask from this afternoon, is if you've got developers in your team, maybe they're not here at this meeting, but you'd like to have them involved in this work, talk to them first, and then please nominate them. If you are keen to get involved in piloting, then fill in the same form, provide your details, and tell us that. That would be fantastic.
Andrew, I just see a question coming through here that's quite pertinent, since you're just finishing off on piloting there. Can you give some sort of idea of what's involved in piloting? Yeah, and I've seen this done at various levels, right? So I have seen some people. So piloting is all about doing a pilot implementation. So actually trying to implement some of the specifications that we come up with and seeing whether it is useful for interchanging data. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, if you get involved in a pilot, it's likely that at least some of the people in there will go on to build something commercial, which is great. The second thing is, a pilot, as we've discovered with the ICAR data standards, actually really helps in terms of discovering what's missing and what's cumbersome in a data specification. So what would be involved in a pilot? You'd probably brief some of your developers and they'd actually cut some code. They'd build some APIs that interchanged some of this data.
Now, it might be a mock, it might be a prototype that doesn't actually connect to any of your production systems. And we learn a lot by doing that. Or it might be that you're actually already planning on doing something, connecting some systems together, in which case you might say, well, we're keen to use that as our pilot. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Another question coming through here, Andrew, is obviously talking to the fact that, you know, much data can be geospatial. Everything happens somewhere. Is there any idea of what scope it is and what is out of regard, what's in and out in terms of what's going to be focused on? I suspect there'll be some self-definition when the group gets together, but how do you see that coming together?
Yeah. So if you have a look at the form online, I'm one of the questions I ask there, and there's not many questions, so don't panic. But one of the questions is, what's the particular challenge or area of scope that you're interested in? Because I think you've got to start somewhere, and you've got to say, well, these ones we're going to do right now, and these ones can wait till some further time because you can't do everything. What I would say, though, in my observation, looking at work that other people have done in this area, is that you can create a, I guess, an approach or a format that can be used and then extended for other things, right? So we might start with some of the key things that are pain points for people in New Zealand right now. How do I get my farm boundary that is not LIN's data? Because obviously LIN's open data, fantastic. But your farm boundary, your operating farm boundary might be different to that. You might be leasing some land or excluding some land. Another question people commonly ask is, what about land management units, right? Which are often defined by the farmer based on where they put the deer fencing or something else. How do we get that information? So if it's those sorts of pieces of data and people are keen to interchange those, I'd see that as a really good fit with our scope. The next area might be activity data, right? I drove a tractor down this row in the vineyard, or I spread fertilizer here. That's kind of another step on. But again, I'm keen to see where people want to work before we kind of make too much of a judgment call.
See some other questions here. It will be good to go through. They've come up since we've been started out there, and one of them is, Andrew, do you have any comments about, you know, open data versus free data for data interoperability?
It's worth saying that what we're talking about here is an open source standard, which means that the standard itself is to be open source, right? So that makes no comment on the data that you might then transfer once you implement something in the standard, right? There are some fantastic, in New Zealand, and again, I see some of the people on the call this afternoon, there's some fantastic repositories of, first and foremost, free open data in New Zealand, some of which applies to agriculture and is highly useful, and we should be making use of that. Secondly, there's some licensable data that's not necessarily free. It may be free, but it's licensable. So it's not necessarily completely open either, right? But you can use it. And again, we should be making use of that stuff if we're to get smarter and avoid farmers typing stuff in. But a lot of the data that people want to exchange is what I would call farm or business specific data. And that tends to be neither open nor necessarily free. It might be free if the person who owns the data is willing to share it. Does that make sense? Hopefully that does. There's a good question.
Another question here, Andrew. What sort of engagement, and I know this has been a topic we've discussed along the way, but, you know, what engagement has there been with LINs? And I know we've also, I can also represent that we have had some conversations, and we'll be collaborating strongly with our friends in Location Tech as well, who obviously maintain a lot of those relationships with LINs and other groups. So, but yeah, any specific comments on your thoughts with discussions with LINs?
So first and foremost, we're very agriculture focused. And so while we're keen to engage with and align with what the Location Tech team are doing, we've perhaps got a slightly different focus. It's a narrower focus. And there's some particular things that are likely to be of interest. Some of those relate to data that LINs is also working on. So There are some of us, again, I see you on the call, myself, others from regional councils and MPI, who have already had some discussions with people from LINZ in this area. And we're very keen to keep on with that engagement as well. And again, they've done a huge amount of work around data interoperability and data interchange as well. We're keen to learn from that. There's a question there, Brendan, which is possibly more for you. Are grassroots farmers able to join these groups?
Well, I think, the answer for you, I think you've sort of depicted what the skills are required for the geospatial work. So absolutely, if we have farmers who also happen to have those interests and skill sets in from an IT perspective, of course, I think fundamentally, of course, we're all focused on producers and growers. These are the customers and the clients of the businesses that we're talking about, and no business is successful without having that as their primary focus. So I think the answer is yes, with the caveat that we're talking about some very specific skill set inputs. Kenneth, do you have a comment there?
Yes, I just wanted to add to that. It's a very good question. Thank you. I would like to throw it a bit wider, and that is that not only is it, while it's true that this is a technical invitation, there's two responses. One is, first of all, there are a lot of highly technically capable farmers. The other is that there are many other ways for farmers to participate. So user centricity is really important. I'd also add that Andrew Hoggart is National President of Federated Farmers, is on the Executive Council of AgriTech New Zealand. And so that's a great pipeline for information coming back right through to the top table of AgriTech NZ. So the broad answer to that question is the more focus, involvement, engagement we can have with farmers, the better. And that covers all sectors, broadacre, pip fruit, stone fruit, kiwi fruit, all the other fruits, specialist, zestberry, and so on. It's a broad church, and nobody's as smart as all of us. So that's a wide statement to a big number represented here.
Since 96% of our territory is underwater, it definitely includes aquaculture as well, by the way.
Good point. Thank you.
It's worth checking, because back in the day when Kenneth and I were members of the Precision Ag Association, merged into AgriTech New Zealand, our farmers were very much, first-class citizens in that association. And I presume that farmers can still become members of AgriTech New Zealand as well, Brendan?
Yeah, there is an individual member category specifically intended for producers and growers. Having said that, we also partner really strongly with organizations with like Landwise, who are even stronger in their capabilities of that type of engagement. But yes, definitely open for those interested. And it is AgriTech sector concerns that we're really looking at progressing. So a strong relationship, but maybe a slightly different angle sometimes.
Worth adding on to your point, Andrew, that it's Precision Ag Association was formed originally to assist farmers in the adoption of on-farm technology. And so it's very much about customer pull, you might say. It's about demand, the demand side of the equation. The generation of AgriTech, although it goes back many years, and it's now in its third iteration. The first one was more about a small number of ag tech businesses who was merely collaborating over export opportunities, shared trade stands at global trade shows and the like. But that's going back many, many years. It was then a little bit in hibernation, sort of under the auspices of field days. And it's only in the last couple of years that AgriTech New Zealand has really stood up and got going. The reason for the merger between PANS and AgriTech was, first of all, we recognised there was merit in having what we call two-handed clapping, meaning both the demand side from farmers and the supply side from AgriTech. So we had both pull and push. And although AgriTech name makes a lot of sense, it's part of New Zealand Tech Alliance, which sets us up with fintech and biotech and so on, insurtech, for a whole bunch of technological reasons. As we turn our attention to farming, it really is important to recognise that almost our first and primary purpose is to optimise the primary sector. As I said at the outset, that's a really important, absolute cornerstone component of the New Zealand economy. And so that's our first calling, but we're very clear, the first equal with that is AgriTech in a sector in and of itself. So farmers are very welcome. That is the reason, as we say, that that individual category was produced. And the more the merrier. That's a really useful dimension to have, both at technical and user level.
100%. Thank you, Kenneth. Just as a final comment and wrap up, we started out the session by introducing the concept that we had two objectives. One is to seek expressions of interest for the AgriTech data industry reference group. So I guess a group that's looking at representing the sector and being strategic, influential, and offering their insight and guidance to many different programs that are happening around the country. So I've cut and pasted the link to the form for that group into the chat. So if that's something of interest, just go into chat now and look for the AgriTech data reference group. It'll be higher up the list. You should find it there. Click that form and put in your details, and we'll be happy to continue the discussion. Also then, of course, the second request is, as Andrew has introduced, for the working group, getting into the meat of all things geospatial and looking at some specifications there. So if that's for you, or you know who, somebody who should be involved there, the second link is also included into the chat. So now will be a good time to go in and click that and get your details logged there. All of today's session has been recorded, and we will publish the recording. We'll distribute the slides. You should know where to find us. We know there's lots of other good work going on out there in the sector. We've got plenty of energy and commitment to both support that work and continue these discussions. So I doubt if this is the last time we'll all be coming together or discussing this topic. I see somebody asking, Mike, in the link, it should be in the chat. Went through for all panelists and attendees. Yeah, so Mike, if you have a look through the list there, you should be able to find it. You might have to scroll back up. I'll tell you, I will enter it again just to make sure that it's coming through.
Brendan, just while you're doing that, can I just grab those 30 seconds? We are coming up to the end of the first full year of AgriTech under its new elected executive council of 11 members. There are 3 seats coming up for re-election. There were original elected seats, and there were some appointed seats. Those came from the PANS background. Those seats come up for election this year, so that we will have a 2-year cycle ongoing. It means that we'll get a yin and yang, you might say, that every year we'll finish up with about half of the council being re-elected for a 2-year term, and that way we get both continuity and fresh minds coming to the table. Can I let it be known that there are 3 seats coming up for election? There's details of this on our website. We've got already expressions of interest from folks that are keen to be involved. We've also got some pretty committed and hard-working members who are holding those seats that were initially appointed. And it's going to
be a good fight, Kenneth. I can see we're going to see some actual political influence going on, I think, to try and see we're going to be starting seeing campaigns using 3 letters.
I see the yard signs coming out very soon. So with that in mind, let me just say that we're very much looking for fresh enthusiasm, but it's going to be a pretty high bar because we've got a great team. We work very well together, despite the fact we've only met actually once in person due to COVID. We're planning to have the July meeting together in a single location, and there's a bit of a scrap over where that's going to be. I won't say where we're shortlisting, I just quite yet, but I will tell you the Bahamas isn't one of them. So with that in mind, that's it from me. We're coming to the close. I'll hand back to Brendan to close formally, but I do want to thank you all for your attendance and say that this has been a good session. We've had, as Brendan said, over 600 people attending the roadshows. We're now broadening out to putting a lot of substance to our collaboration with our sister company in Australia. And all of these things, working with government, working with regional government, regional councils, with industry, large and small, and across quite a broad church. It's a very exciting time for the industry, and we thank you very much for your participation today. It's yet another evidence of the energy, speed, and acumen that's being brought by a very, very large number of people. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you for your comment there, Clary. And people have been asking for the election details. So I just cut and paste the link there. You'll find it on our website. All members should have received nomination forms, and there'll be further communications. Nominations for council positions close on June 8th. I see from the list of people we got here, a really high number of members, which is really appreciated. Our members tend to be the leaders, so they're the type of people who turn up to sessions like this. Thank you all very much. If you happen to be a leader and turning up on a Friday afternoon like this, and you're not a member, that's a real anomaly. And if you'd like to fix it, now is a good time to fix it. Please get in contact in terms of joining as a member. And like I say, if you do that in the next week, still a chance to make sure that you get engaged in the election process, either as a nominee or definitely as a voting member. Thanks very much. It's 4:16. Much as I would like to say that the yard armor's crossed and on a Friday, that's okay for a beer. Strictly speaking, I believe the legal standard is 4:18. So please wait 2 more minutes until you crack open the beer, and I'll see you then. But thank you very much, people.
Thank you all for your attendance.
Thank you all.